My phone started vibrating at 2:58 a.m. At first, I ignored it. I had only been asleep for a few hours, and like most people, I convinced myself that whatever was happening could wait until morning. My family wasn't known for respecting time zones or reasonable hours, so a late-night call wasn't completely unheard of. I silenced the phone without even opening my eyes, rolled over, and tried to fall back asleep. 20 minutes later, it happened again, then again. When I finally reached for the phone and looked at the screen, every trace of sleep disappeared instantly. 31 missed calls, 17 voicemails, 46 unread text messages. Almost every notification came from someone in my family: my mother, my father, my cousin Natalie, my Uncle George. Then 4 calls from an unfamiliar number beginning with the Greek country code. My stomach tightened before I even listened to the first voicemail. My mother's voice was completely unrecognizable. She wasn't crying in the dramatic way people sometimes do when they're overwhelmed. These were genuine, uncontrolled sobs that made it difficult for her to finish a sentence. "Emma, please answer, please call us back. They're saying Sophie could be arrested if we don't solve this tonight." The message ended abruptly. I stared at the screen for several seconds before playing the next voicemail. My father's voice was much calmer, but somehow even more alarming. "Call us immediately, this is serious." The third voicemail came from my aunt. "I don't know exactly what's happening, sweetheart, but your parents desperately need your help. Please call them as soon as you hear this." By the 7th voicemail, the panic had become strangely organized. My mother had stopped crying. Instead, she spoke with the careful urgency of someone repeating instructions she had already practiced several times. "They're demanding 30,000 euros. We don't have that kind of money. Please, you're the only one who can help. 30,000 euros. I sat on the edge of my bed in complete silence. My younger sister Sophie was supposed to be celebrating her wedding on the island of Santorini. Instead, my family was calling me in the middle of the night asking for enough money to buy a small house in some parts of the country. None of it made sense. To explain why I wasn't standing beside my sister that evening, I have to go back almost a year, because if you only heard that I skipped my own sister's destination wedding, you'd probably assume I was selfish, bitter, or simply didn't care about my family. The truth was far more complicated. I loved Sophie more than anyone else in my family. She had always been the person who could make even the worst situations feel manageable. Growing up, she had this rare ability to make people feel heard without saying very much. Teachers adored her. Friends trusted her almost immediately. Even complete strangers seemed comfortable around her after only a few minutes. If anyone deserved a perfect wedding, it was Sophie. Unfortunately, she also had one dangerous habit. She believed the best about everyone. Sometimes that quality made people love her. Other times, it made her the easiest person in the room to manipulate. I noticed it almost immediately when she introduced us to Daniel Mercer. He was 38, charming without trying too hard, well-dressed without appearing flashy, and supposedly worked in what he described as international investment consulting. That description bothered me. Not because investment consulting isn't a real profession, because people who actually work in finance almost never describe their jobs that vaguely. Whenever someone asked what Daniel did, he smiled confidently and answered with just enough detail to sound impressive, while avoiding anything specific. My clients are mostly private investors. I advise international portfolios. I spend most of my time traveling. None of those statements actually explained anything. Most people never noticed. I did. That probably has something to do with my career. For almost 15 years, I'd worked in financial risk analysis, first for a commercial bank in Seattle, and later as a senior investigator for a consulting firm that specialized in uncovering complex financial fraud. My entire career revolved around identifying inconsistencies before they became disasters, patterns, behavior, tiny details that most people ignored. Daniel never triggered one obvious alarm. He triggered dozens of very small ones. Each one was easy to dismiss by itself. Together, they formed a picture I couldn't ignore. Sophie announced their engagement only 7 months after they met. Everyone celebrated. My parents immediately started talking about venues. My relatives couldn't stop posting congratulations online. I congratulated them too. I genuinely wanted my sister to be happy, but privately, I asked her a few careful questions. "Have you met his business partners?" She smiled. "A couple." "Do you know exactly what company he owns?" He explained it. "What did he explain?" She laughed. "You sound like you're interviewing him." Maybe I was, because every answer somehow became less specific instead of more detailed. 3 months before the wedding, my parents proudly announced they had reserved an exclusive cliffside resort overlooking the Aegean Sea. It looked spectacular. It also looked unbelievably expensive. I quietly asked my mother how they planned to afford it. Oh, Daniel has everything under control. That sentence stayed with me. People often believe someone else is handling the finances means the problem has already been solved. In my experience, it usually means nobody has actually looked at them. Over the following weeks, the wedding somehow became even more extravagant. Private yacht excursion, luxury transportation, imported flowers, a guest list that seemed to grow every few days. Every new detail made me more uncomfortable. Not because I thought my sister didn't deserve something beautiful, because the numbers simply didn't add up. Neither Daniel nor my parents had the kind of money they suddenly seemed comfortable spending. Whenever I asked about the budget, someone quickly changed the subject. Eventually, my father stopped pretending to be patient. "You always think something is wrong," he told me during Sunday dinner. "Maybe try being happy for your sister instead of treating everything like an investigation." "I am happy for her." "No," he replied. "You're suspicious." Maybe he was right. Maybe years of investigating financial fraud had made me overly cautious. I spent weeks questioning my own instincts. Eventually, I convinced myself I was probably overthinking everything. When Sophie asked whether I'd be coming to Greece, I told her work had become too busy for international travel. That wasn't entirely true. The truth was much harder to explain. I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the entire wedding was fundamentally wrong. I simply couldn't prove it. So while my family boarded a plane for Santorini, I stayed home in Seattle, telling myself that missing one wedding was better than ignoring an instinct that had protected both my clients and my career for nearly 15 years. I had no idea that less than 24 hours later, my phone would light up with 31 missed calls, and I would discover that someone had built an entire financial disaster using my identity without me knowing it. I replayed my mother's last voicemail one more time before calling my father. He answered before the first ring had fully finished. The background was a mess of overlapping voices, footsteps, and people speaking Greek. Someone was giving instructions in a firm, authoritative tone, while another person argued loudly enough that I had to pull the phone slightly away from my ear. "Emma," my father said quickly, "thank God, we need you to transfer the money immediately." "What happened?" "There was a problem with the resort." "What kind of problem?" "A legal dispute." "That doesn't answer my question." He let out an impatient sigh. "The resort says there are unpaid balances and damage charges. They're refusing to let Sophie leave until everything is settled." Something about his explanation immediately felt wrong, not because luxury resorts never demand payment, because they almost never handle it this way. "Where's Daniel?" Silence. A long silence. The kind that tells you everything before anyone says a word. "Dad." He stepped out. "Stepped out where?" "We don't know." My pulse slowed instead of speeding up. Whenever I interviewed fraud victims, I noticed the same thing happened to me every single time. While everyone else panicked, my thoughts became unusually organized. I stopped reacting emotionally. I started collecting facts. "When did anyone last see him?" "About an hour ago." "Has anyone spoken to him?" "No." "Is his phone on?" "It goes straight to voicemail." I closed my eyes. "What about the wedding gifts?" Another silence. "The envelopes with cash?" No answer. "Sophie's jewelry?" My father still didn't answer. I didn't need him to. The silence confirmed exactly what I had already suspected. "Emma," my mother suddenly said as she took the phone from him, "please don't do this right now. We just need the money. We'll explain everything later. I need to speak with whoever is actually handling this." "What?" "The police, resort management, whoever is demanding the payment. They're busy." "Then wait until they're available." "Emma." I kept my voice completely calm. "I'm not wiring 30,000 euros to another country without understanding exactly what I'm paying for." Another minute of arguing followed before I finally heard the phone changing hands. A different voice came on the line. The man spoke fluent English with a noticeable Greek accent. "Good morning, Miss Bennett. My name is Captain Andreas Nicolaou with the Hellenic Police." "Captain Nicolaou," I said, "I'd like to understand exactly what's happening. There is currently a financial dispute involving the wedding venue and several contractual documents. At this moment, no criminal charges have been filed, but the situation remains under investigation." "Is my sister under arrest?" "No." "Is she free to leave?" "At the present time, we have requested that the involved parties remain available while documentation is being reviewed." That answer was careful, very careful. Professionals choose words for a reason. "So this isn't about property damage?" A brief pause. "No. It concerns financial documentation." "Correct." I grabbed a notebook from my nightstand. "One question." "Of course. Whose name appears on the primary booking agreement?" I expected him to say Daniel's name, maybe my father's, possibly even Sophie's. Instead, he slowly read a name directly from the contract. "Emma Bennett." I felt every emotion disappear. Not panic, not fear, just complete clarity. There must be some mistake. The passport information attached to the contract also matches your name. I've never been to Greece. I understand. I never signed anything. I understand that as well. I thanked him politely. Then I ended the call. For nearly 30 seconds, I simply stared at the blank wall across my apartment. My name, my identity, my responsibility, attached to a luxury resort reservation in another country that I had never agreed to. There was only one way to verify whether this was an isolated mistake. I opened my laptop. My bank accounts looked completely normal. Checking, savings, investment accounts, nothing unusual. Then I logged into the credit monitoring service I'd used for years. Within seconds, I found it. A recently opened international credit account worth nearly $21,000, opened less than a month earlier. I had never seen the lender before. The application listed my social security number, my home address, my legal name, but the verification email wasn't mine. Someone had created an email address, almost identical to my real one. One missing letter, just enough to fool an automated verification system. I leaned back in my chair. Now I understood everything. The wedding hadn't suddenly become a financial disaster. The financial disaster had been planned weeks before anyone boarded a plane. Whoever opened that account had access to every piece of information necessary to steal my identity. My birthday, my social security number, my address. Information almost nobody outside my family knew. I opened Sophie's social media page. 3 weeks earlier, she had posted engagement photos from Greece, luxury hotels, private beaches, champagne dinners, everyone smiling. While those pictures were being uploaded, someone had been borrowing money in my name. The realization should have made me furious. Instead, it made me incredibly focused. People imagine victims of fraud screaming, crying, or making emotional decisions. The opposite is usually more useful. You document first. You react later. I walked into the kitchen and started making coffee, even though I wasn't tired anymore. The familiar routine gave my hands something to do while my mind organized the next several hours. By the time the coffee finished brewing, I already knew exactly what had to happen. Every screenshot, every phone call, every voicemail, every financial record. Everything would be preserved before anyone had the chance to change a single detail. At 3:42 a.m., I began creating a timeline. First, I captured every missed call and voicemail with visible timestamps. Next came screenshots of the newly opened credit account, including the application date, lender information, and fraudulent email address. Then I downloaded complete reports from all 3 credit bureaus. The hard inquiry appeared exactly 24 days earlier, right around the time my family had finalized the destination wedding. Not a coincidence. I continued building the file for almost 2 hours. Phone records, account alerts, credit reports, identity verification logs, everything went into clearly labeled folders with matching timestamps. By sunrise, I had assembled more evidence than most fraud investigators received during the first week of an active case. Only then did I send the first email. The subject line contained just 6 words: identity theft, international fraud, immediate legal review. It went directly to my attorney, Laura Mitchell, one of the best financial fraud lawyers I'd ever worked with. Less than 5 minutes after pressing send, my father called again. This time, I was ready. My father's name appeared on my screen again at exactly 7:11 a.m., only a few minutes after I had finished organizing the last folder of evidence. By then, the sun had already started rising over Seattle, but I hadn't noticed. My apartment looked exactly the way it had several hours earlier, except that my dining table was now covered with printed reports, handwritten notes, and a laptop displaying more financial records than I ever wanted to see connected to my own name. I answered the call, already knowing the conversation wouldn't be pleasant. The first thing I heard was my mother's voice, exhausted from hours of crying. She begged me to forget everything for just one day and send the money before the situation became even worse. According to her, the resort management had become increasingly impatient. Local authorities were still reviewing the documentation, and Sophie had completely fallen apart after realizing Daniel had disappeared without telling anyone where he was going. Under different circumstances, hearing my sister's name in that condition would have been enough to make me act without thinking. This wasn't one of those circumstances. Everything I had uncovered during the previous 4 hours pointed toward a carefully planned financial fraud, not an unfortunate misunderstanding that could be solved with a bank transfer. Sending money now wouldn't protect my sister. It would simply erase the financial trail that investigators were beginning to follow. I calmly explained that every account connected to my identity had already been frozen, and that my attorney was preparing formal fraud reports. For several seconds, nobody answered. The silence on the other end of the line told me they hadn't expected me to respond with legal action instead of sympathy. When my father finally spoke, his frustration was impossible to hide. He insisted that families were supposed to solve problems together instead of involving lawyers and government agencies. In his mind, paperwork could always be sorted out later, while protecting my sister should have been the only priority. Normally, I would have understood that argument. This time, I couldn't. The moment someone opened financial accounts using my personal information, it stopped being a family disagreement and became identity theft. My responsibility wasn't just to myself anymore. If Daniel had done this once, there was a very good chance he had done it before, and every successful cover-up only made it easier for him to choose another victim in the future. Rather than continuing an argument that wasn't going anywhere, I asked to speak directly with Captain Andreas Nicolau again. Fortunately, he was still present at the resort. After introducing himself, he confirmed that investigators were now treating several financial documents as potentially fraudulent, and that additional information had been requested from banks in both Greece and the United States. Without revealing confidential details, he explained that inconsistencies had already appeared in multiple contracts connected to the wedding expenses. That was enough confirmation for me. The investigation was moving in exactly the direction I had expected. As soon as the call ended, my attorney Laura Mitchell contacted me after reviewing every document I had emailed before sunrise. She complimented the organization of the evidence and told me something I hadn't fully appreciated until that moment. Most fraud cases become difficult because victims panic first and document later. By preserving every voicemail, screenshot, account alert, and timestamp before confronting anyone, we had protected evidence that otherwise could have disappeared within hours. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of phone calls. Fraud reports were submitted to all 3 credit bureaus. The international lender received a formal identity theft affidavit. My bank placed additional security measures on every active account. Federal authorities received copies of the fraudulent credit application, along with documentation showing that I had never traveled to Greece or signed any agreement connected to the wedding venue. By early afternoon, there was nothing left for me to do except wait. Ironically, waiting turned out to be the easiest part. Less than 48 hours later, my phone rang again. This time it was Captain Nicolau. His voice sounded noticeably different from our previous conversations. Calmer, more confident. He informed me that Daniel Mercer had been located at Athens International Airport while attempting to board a flight leaving the country. Investigators discovered that he was carrying a significant amount of undeclared cash along with several valuable items that members of my family had already reported missing after the wedding collapsed. As officers continued examining his luggage and electronic devices, they uncovered evidence suggesting that Sophie's wedding had never been his final objective. Financial records, digital communications, and partially completed applications indicated that he had been preparing similar schemes for months, using romantic relationships to gain access to personal information before financing expensive events through stolen identities. The wedding hadn't fallen apart because of one bad decision. It had been carefully designed from the very beginning. A few days after Daniel's arrest, Sophie finally called me herself. She sounded nothing like the optimistic woman who had spent months planning the perfect destination wedding. Every sentence carried the weight of someone trying to understand how her entire future had disappeared almost overnight. She admitted that Daniel had handled nearly every financial decision during the engagement because he constantly reassured everyone that international weddings required complicated paperwork. Whenever documents needed signatures or identification, he always had an explanation ready, and nobody questioned him because confidence is often mistaken for competence. Listening to her, I realized something that made the entire situation even sadder. Daniel hadn't manipulated people because they were foolish. He manipulated them because they trusted someone they loved. Trust isn't a weakness. It's simply something dishonest people know how to exploit. Sophie apologized for dismissing my concerns during the engagement, admitting that she remembered every conversation where I had asked simple questions that nobody else wanted to hear. At the time, she believed I was being overly cautious because of my profession. Looking back, she understood that I had never claimed to know Daniel was a criminal. I had only recognized a pattern that didn't make sense. That distinction mattered. Instinct isn't magic. It's experience noticing details before your conscious mind fully understands them. Our conversation ended differently than I expected. Neither of us talked about blame. Instead, we talked about rebuilding trust, accepting painful lessons, and making sure neither of us allowed one terrible experience to define the rest of our lives. My parents, unfortunately, struggled much more with accepting responsibility. Several weeks later, they asked if we could meet for dinner. For most of the evening, they spoke about how stressful everything had been, how embarrassed they felt, and how nobody could have predicted Daniel's deception. They described the entire disaster as an unfortunate mistake that had affected everyone equally. Only when they finished did I quietly explain why I couldn't see it the same way. Daniel had absolutely committed the crime. There was no question about that, but my personal information hadn't reached him by accident. Someone had provided enough private details for financial applications to be completed without my knowledge, and not once during the wedding planning process had anyone thought to ask whether I was comfortable becoming financially connected to an event I wasn't even attending. My family had described me as the responsible one whenever they needed advice, paperwork, or help solving complicated problems. Somewhere along the way, that reliability slowly transformed into an expectation that my identity, my time, and my financial stability would always be available whenever someone else needed them. That realization hurt far more than the fraud itself, because it wasn't created by one criminal. It had been quietly reinforced over many years by the people I loved most. Over the following months, every fraudulent account was permanently removed from my credit history. The international lender officially canceled every obligation created in my name, and investigators connected Daniel to multiple cases that shared nearly identical methods in different countries. What initially appeared to be an isolated wedding disaster eventually became part of a much larger criminal investigation. Today, Sophie and I still speak regularly. Our relationship survived because honesty eventually replaced denial. My relationship with my parents is different, not broken, simply built on healthier boundaries than before. Looking back, I don't think the most important lesson was learning how to recognize fraud. My career had already taught me that years earlier. The lesson that stayed with me was much more personal. The people who genuinely care about you will never expect you to sacrifice your identity, your reputation, or your future just to make an uncomfortable situation disappear. Anyone who asks for that, no matter how close they are, is asking for far more than they have any right to receive. And sometimes the strongest decision you can make isn't rescuing everyone else from the consequences of their choices. It's protecting yourself before those consequences become yours.